Welcome to Indigenous Threads. I am Giusto Medio Boccheni. This season is dedicated to Indigenous women and climate change. Today we are with Poelina. She comes as representative of the sociocultural region of the Pacific. Anne holds several academic titles, including 2 PhDs and different masters. She is the co-chair of Indigenous Studies and senior research fellow at the Nulungu Institute, University of Notre, Australia. She is the chair of the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council. She's an active community leader. She's a human and earth rights advocate, and she's a filmmaker. Most importantly, though, Anne is an Indigenous woman, so I'm going to now leave her the floor to introduce herself again in her mother tongue.
Mabubara, ngajunu nilwal and Poelina, ngayo im Martuwarra manen, ngayo mandajara nyigana nganga, ngayo nganga in Jugun and Yaru country, in Broome, ngayo home. So in my language I said, good day, my name is Poelina. I am a woman who belongs to the Martuwarra, the Fitzroy River, in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, Australia. And today I am speaking to you and with you on Jugun and Yaru country in Broome, Western Australia, which is my home.
Thank you, Anne. This session of the podcast is aimed at recounting stories of Indigenous women in the context of climate change. And we know how Indigenous people are burdened with the worst effect of climate change, but also at the forefront of combating it. And Indigenous women, more specifically, keep bringing such evidence and keep providing their knowledge. And through their ways of life, through the intrinsic relationship with nature, they are demonstrating how Indigenous people's action and example is essential in preventing the disaster that climate change is heralding. So I want to know from you, Anne, since you wrote a lot on this topic, what do you think as a scholar, as an activist, as an Indigenous woman yourself? And it would be great if you could share a story of origin of your people, describe your community, and bring up anything else that you think is relevant to address the topic that we are discussing today.
Yeah, look, thank you for the opportunity to speak with listeners. The first point is I do not describe myself as an activist. I describe myself as an actionist in terms of I don't want to pick activism just for activism's sake. I follow the work of Paulo Freire, which talked about colonization and decolonization. And the big thing that Paulo Freire talked about was how do we create dialogue? How do we come from a space where we can talk together with multiple worldviews of how we deal with complexity? So from my position, I describe myself as an actionist, not an activist. And activists are so important. But my role is to bring my worldview and my philosophy and my positioning and the wisdom I have, which has been handed down over thousands and thousands of generations, to work with other people in terms of how do we deal with the complexity of climate change, climate chaos, climate war. So what we are saying as Indigenous people in this country is I live in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. It's on the Indian Ocean side. I live in a catchment that is over 96,000 square kilometres. It is an extremely diverse valley track system where has been lots of upfolds and down and different changes. So the biodiversity in the valley track is extremely is globally unique and is of world heritage and is of world value. So this system is so diverse. We have what we call a sawfish, which is a freshwater shark that born in the river and grows to 7 meters, 21 feet of fish. And what we're saying is that this biodiversity, these animals, these creatures, we see them as our family, our non-human kin. So we as Indigenous people in this country, we, like other fellow Indigenous people and Native people across the world, we have not walked away from the Garden of Eden. We have stayed and been good custodians and guardians of our beautiful country wherever we are across the planet. And what we're finding from the science, from everyone, from IPBES, from IUCN, is exactly as you said. we have contributed the least amount to climate change and climate war, yet we have the greatest impact. And one of that is because we as Indigenous people live in a coexistence with nature. We have our non-human kin as our family, the birds, the trees, the animals. We see them as equal to human being, and that they have a right to exist and to live and to reach their full potential. Our elders teach us that everything is alive. The rocks, the trees, the wind, the moon, the stars, everything has alive. It's all about energy. So from that perspective, what we're saying as Indigenous people is that even the rights of nature story has been led by Indigenous people at the front line, defending their homelands, defending their tribal lands, defending their rivers and their living water systems. So what we're saying is that the rights of nature have been led by Indigenous people, with us working with great scholars, practitioners, legal scholars, who are also pushing the boundaries, because what we're saying, and what I say sometimes, is we are all Indigenous to Mother Earth. How do we grow a sense of ethics and care and love? Because this is one planet. Whether we live in Brazil or Australia, South America, Peru, China, Taiwan, we are all connected by the living waters of our oceans, our rivers, and so therefore we must see ourselves as planetary human beings with a duty of care to protect our homelands, nature, rivers, but also Mother Earth, whom we're so reliant on to reach our full potential as human beings. So this is an amazing place. The river system that I was born into, when I introduced myself, I said, Ngayu I Martuwarra Manan, which means I am a woman who belongs to the river, the Martuwarra, the Fitzroy River. So as an Indigenous person, the river has created my identity. The river is a living ancestral being. We cry with it, we laugh with it, we have ceremony, we tell stories. We are deeply connected to a living water system, which we believe are ancestral beings who not only have a right to life, but a right to live and flow. So very, very important that from an Indigenous perspective, we see everything in coexistence, that the commons are for the greater good of all of us. And so we must find the solutions to work with non-Indigenous people from multiple disciplines to look at how do we preserve these last bastions of biodiversity that the multinationals and the corporation and corrupt governments are coming to. Because what my elders teach me is that it's all about energy, and we cannot keep extracting the energy systems of Mother Earth without destabilizing it. And so therefore we are now in a situation where climate change, climate chaos, climate wars are very, very real. And we as Indigenous people are at the front line of unjust development. And so we need to work with other people to bring in a body of evidence to say why it can't be business as usual, why we need to look at new ways of creating economies that are not only going to be sustainable development, but sustain our lifeways as Indigenous people.
Thank you, Anne. You really laid out a complex and comprehensive perspective on the matter. You touch upon so many intertwined problems that are all relevant to the situation of Indigenous peoples and their relationship with nature. Actually, both in your work and in your words right now, I find incredibly insightful what you have to say about the Martuwarra Fitzroy River. So would you care to share a bit more about that?
Yeah, no, the river is an amazing system. And one of the things was a couple of years ago, Maori people in New Zealand led the first legal case where their river was recognised as a living being, the Wanganui, the Whanganui River, and so it has legal standing and personhood. And so when I heard this story about how this river had been granted personhood, I went back to my wise people and we had counsel, and I said, there's this wonderful story in New Zealand where the river has been recognised as a personhood and has got legal standing. And the other elders in the council looked at me as if I was crazy, and they said, in regards to the Martuwarra, the river, not a human being? So the river is not a human being. It is an ancestral being. And so some of the writings that I have is really pushing the boundaries of legal pluralism to say that the world, they recognise the rights of nature. Now the world needs to recognise that our ancestral beings have a right to life and to live. So we're pushing the boundaries in terms of the Martuwarra. One of the things also in my writing was I like to push the boundaries and be brave. And one of the things was when I started to write about the Martuwarra, the first abstract in the world that was written in an Indigenous language came from us. And now the Martuwarra is recognized as an author. So many of the publications that I have has the river, Martuwarra River of Life, as the first author. And so we have to be brave as Indigenous people and push the boundaries and give voice to our ancestors. And even though we write in a Western context of peer-reviewed publications and those sorts of things, we have to try and find the way of telling the story differently. And that's one of the things that the elders say. In a time of climate change, in a time of climate chaos and climate wars, we seem to be testosteroned out on science. There is so much science telling the world what we should be doing, yet the science is being ignored in all of our nations, and it seems to be that the multinational companies, the corporations, are in charge, and so they determine the rules of engagement. So what my people say is that we have a saying, wake up the snake. Now, wake up the snake means how do you wake up the consciousness of everyday ordinary people to tell the story, to give that emotional hook, to bring the people with you. Because we know that it is people who put governments in power and it is people who can depower them. So we need to find creative ways of telling our story to wake up the consciousness of the mainstream, of Western society, of our nation states, to say that it cannot continue to be business as usual. And so film, ceremony, songs, dance are creative ways of us using our Indigenous storytelling method to bring our people with us, but also Western science and hopefully government and people in power who can say, we need to stop, we need a total new framework. My friend who has published an amazing book says we need a total reset. We cannot continue with business as usual. And one of the things that we say is there's an Extinction Rebellion people that are working across the globe. And, someone said to me, if we as human beings are so stupid that we allow our own demise, Mother Earth will right-size herself and she will go on living. And I said, yes, Mother Earth is powerful. She will right-size herself and go on living. But if we don't do the right thing, she will be lonely without the footsteps of human beings. So Indigenous cultures around the world have foreseen what is coming. They have foreseen this great injustice. And when you hear the prophecies from, North American Indigenous people from Brazil, they're saying the same thing. This dream that we have was told to us that this would happen, that these empires would create. All of this is about greed and destruction. And this is where the multinationals and corrupt governments are standing. And so we need a different way for all of us to connect, for all of us to come together and say, we are dealing with complexity. How do we have a total reset across the planet so that we can have a future for our young people not yet born?
Your words are very powerful, and I am most captivated by your emphasis on stories, on which you have also written quite a bit. And actually, stories seem key in analyzing the potential that Indigenous people have in turning the trend on our approach to what is happening with the climate. And I say our, meaning society as a whole, including non-Indigenous people and their institutions and corporations and governments, because so far they have been affecting negatively the environment. And of course, they have been disenfranchising, sidelining a lot of Indigenous people around the world. And the effects have been seen immediately on biodiversity, which Indigenous people are stewarding all over the planet. So I would like to know, given your expertise, your knowledge, your relations to the territory of Australia, and the related sociocultural region as a whole, about the effects that Indigenous activism have had, and on the other end, the effects that climate change has had on Indigenous people.
Yeah, no, stories are so important, and particularly stories that have been passed down over the generation. Now, one of the things is a very senior elder who is now deceased. In the early 70s, he put what we call first law stories, law of the land, not law of man. So in these stories, before he started writing, he said how our people's world changed when settlers came and invaded us and then started to cut up our country by putting fence lines and making a property right. So taking our lands, taking our rivers, taking our waters, and turning them into property rights for the settler as part of the invasion. And he says from that story, when the fence lines started to cut up our lands, that's when our world changed. And today, what we see is a different type of cutting up the land, where we have people who are very, very interested in exploiting this amazing system for fracking. And so when you do fracking, you cut the land up to create the grid lines so that you can then start to put your wells on board and start to extract gas. Now, one of the things we're talking about is the extraction of the ability to frack the land for oil and gas. And what I am saying in my country is that we've heard about the tar sands project in Canada. If they frack my lands and waters, this is a basin that's nearly 600,000 square kilometres. So if they frack this basin and start to introduce fracking, it is likely to be the largest man-made destruction on the planet. It will be bigger than the Canada tar sands. So prior to January 2023 this year, many people will not know, but where I live on my lands and in this watershed and catchment, we had the greatest flood ever in the known history of white people, settler people, and the whole of the catchment was totally flooded. I live in a remote community. All of our houses were all underwater. They are still underwater, and we have not been able to go back. We've seen loss of infrastructure, loss of homes, but really what we're saying is that no one is measuring the biodiversity loss, for the multi-species justice, for the lizards, for the snakes, for the birds, for the animals that walk on the ground. So at the moment, we're still in a bit of a recovery phase, and people are looking at how do we repair the infrastructure. But the most critical infrastructure to my people is the health and well-being of the catchment, the land, the living waters on which we live. Many of our people live in fourth world conditions, and people don't know this from outside our country because they see Australia as a very, very wealthy country, but most Indigenous people live in fourth world conditions. Water that's not fit for human consumption, housing that is overcrowded, and so many people outside of Australia do not realise that Indigenous people are living with this. We as Indigenous people in the Kimberley, we have the highest rate of suicide for our young people because of the impacts of colonisation, the intergenerational impacts of violence on our families and communities. So the point I'm making is that at the moment we're just going through a huge flood that was the biggest ever in the known history of white people in this country. And the devastation in infrastructure has been huge, but nobody is measuring the impact of the biodiversity loss and the multi-species loss. And so one of the things I'm doing as a scientist, as a leader on the ground, is that I'm working with the elders, working with our community to say, before you came and before we had this flood, what we have seen over the last 10 years is temperatures rising, sea level rising, saltwater intrusion into freshwater systems. And what we're saying is that climate change is real, government. Climate change and climate chaos is real. And instead of investing in weaponry and nuclear submarines, we should be looking at how do we invest in sustainable lifeways, investing in community, investing in new economies, finding a different way to create what we call the economics of well-being. Because for us, it's not just about money. It's the ability to exchange social capital, human capital, cultural capital, natural capital, and to bring all of that in so that we can have well-being and our young people can reach their full potential. So it's a very real thing in terms of what the government is planning where I live is all around water. So I'm not sure how many people understand that in Australia we have a big system called the Murray-Darling Basin, which is on the east coast, and all that's told us is the stories of ownership, foreign ownership of water, water trading, water markets, who owns the water. So Australia is a very, very strange place in terms of, at the moment, what I see is that as Indigenous people, we cared for these commons for the greater common good, but now the multinationals are on our doorstep wanting to extract gas, wanting to extract diamonds, wanting to do all of this unjust development. And what we need to do as leaders is build the body of evidence, science, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous wisdom, and bring that into a way that we can have better localized regional governance of all of us sitting at the table, from what Paulo Freire talks about in terms of how do we decolonize. And the first way we do that is something has to switch in our brain to believe that we as Indigenous people, we have to dream and think and act as sovereign and free people. We have to push the boundaries and be brave. Look for those people who support us to create the news stories, film, ceremony, song, dance, but also to work with people who can create publications to get out there in the world to show that Indigenous people are united. And the governance model we want is a governance model for all, so that we can have, as Paulo Freire says, cooperation, unity, cultural synthesis or pluriverse. We as Indigenous people globally, we are the first scientists. We practice eugenics. We are the anthropologists, the archaeologists, the astronomers, the water scientists. So that wisdom really needs to be lifted up and truly valued by the world if we are to have a climate chance. Because this knowledge has been passed down through thousands and thousands of years of us as Indigenous people living with and shaping the Anthropocene. And so very, very important that our knowledge, our wisdom, our lived experience, our observation is shown to our fellow citizens, but also to governments that this is what is going to happen if we don't right-size what we're doing and have a total reset. In our country, Australia, a year or so ago, we had young people who took the Commonwealth, our nation state, to court because they believed the Minister for the Environment had a duty of care to intergenerational equity for young people. And so when the courts put that up, they said, yes, this is right. But the government challenged that and took it to another court case. And the court case found that the Minister for the Environment at the nation-state level does not have a duty of care to ensure intergenerational equity for our young people. So some of the work I do, I write about lawful, awful laws. And so part of that is how are we brave as Indigenous people to challenge the structural violence, to challenge these systems of law. Because one of the things we say is, as I spoke about, first law is law of the land, the laws that were given to us from nature to live in coexistence, to live in peace, to live in harmony with our non-human family, but also because now wherever we live, we have also now got other nations living with us, other non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people. So when we come together for a governance mechanism, we must be thinking of a biocultural mechanism, but we must be thinking about this from what I call a watershed perspective. We cannot continue to develop in our regions if we're only looking down and looking within our place space. We have to get a regional context, we have to get a national context, and we have to get a global context if we are to have a total reset and really have a climate chance.
So I think you addressed so many aspects of what is happening. And now I would like to focus more specifically on the role of Indigenous women in all this. As an Indigenous woman yourself, or given your expertise and knowledge about other Indigenous women within your community or outside of it, in Australia and elsewhere around the world, I would like to know your thoughts on the role of Indigenous women both in terms of what effects climate change is having on Indigenous women, but also perhaps more importantly, on how Indigenous women are helping, leading the counteraction, also in light of their traditional role as maintainer of the harmony and well-being of humans, non-humans, and the planet, as the idea of Mother Earth evokes, and as so many Indigenous peoples' cosmologies highlight.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point to make. And as Indigenous women, we're almost hardwired to think about an ethics of care and love, one for our fellow community members, but this is part of our makeup, our genetic structure, is that we are about life. We create life, we make life, we nurture life. We are the carers and the preparers of food, the distribution of food. And, a lot of times many Indigenous women will go hungry to feed their family and their children. So I live in a place that really is only just starting to value the voice of women, because when we were invaded, many of the anthropologists were men. And so there's been a separation in the status of Indigenous women to Indigenous men, and Indigenous men have been always elevated, and the voices of women have been muted because that was part of that discipline and the gender of anthropologists. So there was a lot of writing about what Indigenous men shared at the beginning of this engagement and this interaction with anthropologists, archaeologists. And so one of the big challenges has been to raise the voice of women and to give women a voice and to recognise that as Indigenous women, we have our own law as well in terms of an ethics of care and love for the greater good of our community. So sometimes you'll see a separation in terms of what people may say, oh, this is men's business and that's women's business. But for women, at the end of the day, it's community business. So we are investing in the well-being of our whole community. And so it's very, very interesting. But because many times living on the lands, we are the ones who are the major food gatherers. The men will go and hunt and go and get a big animal, a kangaroo or an emu. But it's relying on the women to catch the fish, to cook the fish, to gather the herbs, to gather the spices, to gather the medicines, and to bring that in. So through that way of living, women are at the front line of observing how nature is changing, how the impacts of climate change are changing the biodiversity, how we are losing food security and medicine security because these plants are no longer flowering, they're out of season, the reduction of food supply is very, very obvious, the rise in sea level, which changes the river system as well because it's integrated. So women are at the front line, and because we are, in a way, programmed to think about nurturing, caring, life, we come to this with a different set of values to men who look at, a lot of times about different ways of community business. So women are at the front line of seeing these changes on the land, the water, the food, all of those sorts of things, because we are the food gatherers, we are the food cookers, and we are the ones that think about the greater good of our community. So over the past 10 years, I've been working mainly with women and giving them an opportunity to have voice and share with me how their lands, their water, their food and their medicine is changing. And it's been very, very profound. A couple of our senior women were recently published last year in a very important journal around looking at what we call seasonal calendars. So seasonal calendars have been used by our people in this region for some time, where we mark out the seasonal calendars, we say what season food is going to be shared, going to be produced. We have plants that when they flower, we know the crocodile eggs are hatching. So all of these signs are now out of sync. And so what women leaders who are publishing are saying is that these seasonal calendars is the body of evidence to show how our lands, our water, our food, our medicine is changing. And what we're saying is that we are creating peer-reviewed information from our elders to give to water planners, to tell them, hey, slow down, look at the system, look at the impacts now. What is it going to be like if you want to take, thousands and thousands of gigalitres of water from our system? How is that going to change our lifestyle? So you are right. Women are at the front line of these systems because of we are genetically wired to have an ethics of care and love and think at the end of the day, not just about women's business or men's business, but at the end of the day, the well-being of our whole community and our whole society. So we bring a different lens in terms of doing that, but because of our role as food gatherers, food preparers, food cook people, we can see these changes happening right now. I was talking with another Indigenous woman yesterday, and she was talking about changes on her country and what's happening there, and how with the sea level rise, it is now infiltrating the burial grounds on the coast, and bones are being exposed and all of this. But also she was saying that one of the ceremonies, they needed to go and harvest some fish and bring fish in to cook for the ceremony. And when she brought the fish in, they were diseased. They had lumps on them, the scales had changed, all of these sorts of things. So this is why women are so important to tell the story about climate change and climate impacts. So when she caught the fish and was scaling it, ready to prepare, she saw that the fish was starting to become mutated, that it had sores on it, that it was infected by a disease. And then from that observation, she can then work with the men about how they would look at the land, how they would look at the ocean, how they would look at the small creek systems to see what was impacting on the change of the food supply to the big fish as well. So very, very important that women's voices not be muted, that they be given an opportunity to share their wisdom and to bring that into understanding the true impacts on food insecurity, medicine insecurity, sea level rise, temperature increases, and how the systems are changing. And as I said, we have these bio-indicators, we call them from a science perspective, but these are the signs of how the land is changing. And as I said, on my lands we have a special tree that when it drops its flower, it tells us the crocodile eggs are hatching, the flowers aren't flowering. And so everything is out of sync. And so this observation is science because it's participatory, it's very, very real. So the voices of women need to be a really important part of changing the story around climate change, because we are at the front line of caring for our families and our communities in food collection, food preparation and food cooking.
Thank you, Anne. You have been so eloquent in your reply. Now, as a parting question, I just want to address quickly one of the many issues you touched upon, which was the connection between Indigenous people's knowledge and science and so-called Western science. I am especially interested in knowing from you something more about planetary health, since you wrote extensively and even addressed the UN General Assembly on the subject, and maybe also mention something related to indigenous sovereignty and how it is an essential condition for arriving at solutions that are really for the good of Mother Earth and the people that live on it. Actually, it really struck with me when you mentioned how the planet would be lonely without humans on it. I think this is a very helpful way of thinking of planetary health from a perspective that might not be human-centered, but is crucially relevant to humans.
Yeah, no, that's very important. I think one of the things I just want to go back and say is that the ancient wisdom that we have is Indigenous science. A lot of people talk about it as traditional local knowledge, but this is wisdom that's been generated over thousands and thousands and thousands of years of lived experience, observation of our lands, observation of the environment, but also being tuned in as Indigenous people because we see our non-human family as kin. And so even the animals can teach us how to be good human beings. So one of the things I want to say is that this ancient knowledge that we have, it needs to be reframed. In this country, we have been calling it Indigenous science from the early 80s, and it sits side by side as one of a major discipline that needs to be complementary. Because as I said early in my sharing of the talk, was that we live in a world of complexity. We no longer live just as Indigenous people. And so when we're looking at all of this information, we need to be thinking of the greater good of all, but also of multi-species justice. So from that perspective, I just want to say that it's very, very important when we talk about the world in which we live and we frame it from a first law perspective. These are the laws that were given to us from nature to teach us how to read the land, how to read the river systems. And so one of the things we need to do is be very, very proud of who we are as Indigenous people, the first people, the native people, and that this concept of sovereignty, as I said, spoken by Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, he said the first thing we have to do is believe in our own sovereignty and believe in our own freedom, and we must be brave and push the boundaries out. So it's very, very important that we see ourselves as sovereign people, unique people who have lived with the Anthropocene. We have shaped the Anthropocene, and now it has become diseased. And so we're in a really complex situation where I believe from the wisdom and the dreaming and the future seeing and the prophecies of our people around the world, that Mother Earth will right-size herself, and that there will be human beings who will be brave and who will be able to coexist in a new world. I spend a lot of time traveling and in taxis and talking to people from a whole range of different backgrounds. And what many people tell me who have come to our lands is that they've seen empires rise and they have seen empires fall. And so what this is becoming, globalization and the pursuit of economic capital at the great cost to everything else, is that this system of governance, this global predatory elite, will implode, will fall, and there will be a reliance on the wisdom of Indigenous people across this planet to help with the total reset. So we are in a waiting time, we're in a time and a moment in time where we see that this will occur, this climate chaos. We saw a little bit of this with COVID in terms of how the multinationals and the drug companies were responding to all of this. But what we're saying is that we, as Indigenous people, we see the future. We dream the future to us. And through this, we can have the reliance that the prophecies, the stories of our elders will stand the test of time. And it will be Indigenous people and our wisdom that the Westerners will be looking for in the next 10 to 20 years if we can stand together in solidarity. So very, very important to hold that this wisdom, this complexity we know, is because we must first realize that we are sovereign. We are human being. And to be a human being is a great honor, a great privilege, because my sister tells me we must see with our ears and listen with our eyes. And so we bring in a different way to see the world and be in the world. And the work that I've written around planetary health combined voices of different Indigenous leaders from across the planet, because this is complex and we need to come together and bring our collective wisdom, because each one of us have a strength, and as sovereign people we have much to contribute to right-sizing the planet and having a total reset.
Thank you, Anne. It's been an outstanding session. I'm very grateful. Thank you for giving us the time. And hopefully we're going to have other chances to speak again.
Thank you. Because one of the things I'll finish off is I heard a podcast with David Suzuki. And David Suzuki was talking to a friend of mine, Tyson Yunkaporta. And David Suzuki said when he bent down to pick his grandson up, he just wept profusely and thinking, what is the world he is bringing his grandson into? But we must have hope. We must have dreams, and we send the dream out and we find each other and we walk in that dream together. Galia Mabu. Thank you very much. Take care.
This has been Indigenous Threads, a podcast series promoted by McGill University's Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned.